The soil under Earl Mobley's boot smelled wrong on the morning of May 3, 1994. Not rotten, something quieter than that. Flat, closed off, like soil that had decided not to cooperate. He crouched without thinking about it, the way a man crouches when he already knows what his hands are going to find, and turned a fistful of dirt between his fingers. The structure was fine, too fine, and threaded through it, barely visible in the gray pre-dawn light, were the pale segmented bodies of wireworm larvae, the larval stage of click beetles, Melanotus communis, running through his prepared seedbed in numbers he had never seen on this ground. Earl was 67. He had been walking this particular stretch of Barton County, Kansas, since he was 11 years old, first beside his father Harold, then alone after Harold died in 1971 of a stroke beside this same fence line, then with the knowledge Harold left behind pressed into 3 spiral notebooks that sat in a tin box on Earl's kitchen shelf. He read the soil the way a doctor reads a face, not with instruments, not with pamphlets, but with something accumulated across 56 years that had no clean name. He stood and looked down the length of the east field, 48 acres of prepared corn ground. The wireworm channels ran from the fence line all the way to the creek edge. This was not isolated pressure. This was the field. Earl carried $180,000 remaining on the note at First National Bank of Great Bend. The east field alone was supposed to carry 155 bushels per acre at the commodity price of $2.40 per bushel that spring, $17,856 in projected income from one field. Combined with the West Field's 112 acres, his operation projected $41,664 in gross, before fuel, seed, fertilizer, and the maintenance schedule he kept on every piece of equipment he owned. The bank note required a payment of $22,400 in November. Planting was scheduled for May 13th. He did not make a phone call that morning. He walked every row. If you've never heard this story, subscribe. Stories like this disappear if no one tells them. The county extension office in Great Bend occupied a low brick building on 10th Street, and Dale Prescott had worked out of it for 19 years. He was 52, held a master's degree in agronomy from Kansas State University, and had spent 2 decades steering Barton County farmers through commodity cycles, drought watches, and federal program enrollment. He was not a cruel man. He was a confident one, which is a different thing entirely. Earl drove the 11 miles to Great Bend in his 1986 Chevrolet C10 on the morning of May 5th, and laid 3 photographs on Prescott's desk. He had taken them with a disposable camera and had them developed overnight at the Rick Saul on Kansas Avenue. The photographs showed wireworm larvae in cross-section cuts of soil at roughly 40 individuals per square foot in the worst zones of the east field. Prescott looked at the photographs for less than a minute. He said, "Earl, you've got wireworm pressure, no question. Your option right now is chlorpyrifos soil incorporation. Get your seed treated if it isn't already, and push your planting date back 2 weeks. That'll run you around $4,000 in treatment," Earl said, "and if the pressure runs deeper than the treatment reaches." Prescott leaned back in his chair. Then you'll have a conversation with your crop insurance agent about what the prevent plant provisions look like. That was the end of the useful part of the conversation. What came after was worse. Larry Catlett, who farmed 3 sections south of Earl's ground and had been waiting in the hallway, heard the exchange through the open doorway. Catlett repeated the story at Decker's feed and grain later that same afternoon in the particular way that men in small communities tell stories that make someone else look smaller, not from malice, but from the pleasure of being the man who was in the right place to know something first. He said Earl Mobley had walked into the extension office with wireworm photographs and walked out with a bill he couldn't afford for a problem he couldn't fix. The community's sympathy was genuine and brief. Barton County had seen worse. In 1994, the options for wireworm pressure were chlorpyrifos or crop insurance, and those were not opinions but facts, and Prescott had stated them correctly. What Prescott did not know, and what Catlett could not have known, was that Earl had not driven to that office looking for options. He had driven there to look at Dale Prescott's face when the photographs went on the desk. Earl had already spent 3 nights with Harold's notebooks. Harold Mobley survived the 1934 drought and the 1936 blow season and the 1952 flood that took half the bottomland in Barton County. He did it with a 4th-grade education, 40 acres of rented ground, and a habit of writing down everything he noticed. The spiral notebooks were not journals in any literary sense. They were field records, temperature on a given morning, depth of soil moisture on a given date, which crops held in which zones when everything else burned or blew or drowned. The entry that mattered was dated August 12, 1938. Harold had written it in pencil, in the deliberate, unspelled handwriting of a man who wrote slowly because he wanted to get it right. Wireworm bad in the east patch this, sir. County man says treat and wait. But I notice the worm runs thickest where the old buffalo grass roots went deepest, same places the winter rye held last. That soil holds moisture 3 days longer than the clay ground to the north. If a man plants sweet sorghum in those corridors instead of corn, the sorghum roots go deeper and the worm moves on by August. Sorghum don't mind. And if you run it to syrup, the price is better than corn ever was. Earl had read this entry once before in 1971, the week after Harold's funeral, and filed it in the back of his memory the way farmers file knowledge they do not currently need. In the spring of 1994, sitting at the kitchen table with the notebook open and a cup of coffee gone cold beside him, he read it again and measured it against everything he now knew about the East Field. The zones of heaviest wireworm pressure in 1994 ran along the old buffalo grass corridors, the same low-lying channels that held soil moisture 5 days after a rain when the rest of the field had dried to dust. Earl had measured this moisture retention himself for 12 consecutive years, without knowing precisely why he kept measuring it, because Harold had taught him to measure things he did not yet understand. Sweet sorghum, specifically the heritage variety called honey drip, developed in the 1880s and still available through a seed house in Salina, was not vulnerable to wireworm pressure the way corn was. Its root architecture was different, deeper, more fibrous, harder to interrupt. A wireworm's feeding window was narrow. By the time sorghum roots reached the depth where wireworm larvae concentrated, the larvae had already transitioned to pupa. Harold had understood this without the vocabulary to describe it in any terms an agronomist would recognize. The sorghum would also produce a sugar-dense stalk that, when pressed and cooked to concentration, yielded a dark molasses that had been a staple of the Great Plains table before cheap corn syrup replaced it in the 1960s. The price at direct markets ran between $7 and $9 per quart jar in the early 1990s. Earl had noticed this at a craft fair in Hutchinson in 1992 and had, in the way of farmers who notice things without knowing why yet, written the number down. Earl ordered 40 pounds of honey drip seed from Salina Seed Exchange on May 6th. He said nothing about it to anyone. He planted the East Field on May 14th, one day after his originally scheduled corn date, using his 1953 International Harvester Super MTA tractor. A red machine, 35 horsepower at the belt, rebuilt twice in his ownership, once in 1974 and again in 1989. He ran his father's 1948 John Deere Van Brunt grain drill behind it, 7-foot width with the grass seed box converted for sorghum, setting seed at 3/4 of an inch in the wireworm corridor zones, and 1 inch in the firmer clay ground to the north. He planted the West Field in corn as planned, treating only the 30 acres of worst wireworm pressure with a half-rate chlorpyrifos application at a cost of $1,100. He filed no extension paperwork. He told no one. Vera Stull, who had farmed the section directly north of Earl's for 41 years since her husband Howard died in 1978, noticed the Van Brunt drill running through the East Field on May 14th and drove her 1979 Ford F-100 down to the fence line to see what seed was going in. She watched for 20 minutes from the cab. She did not get out. She did not ask. She drove back to her barn. That was Vera. By June 15th, the sweet sorghum stood 18 inches tall in the East Field. Corn across Barton County was tasseling at 4 to 5 feet in good ground and stalling below knee height in wire-damaged ground. Earl's East Field looked, from the county road, like nothing any of the neighboring farmers had planted that year. It was darker green than corn, thicker stemmed, moving differently in the afternoon wind, slower, heavier, as though the stalks carried more weight than their height warranted. Larry Catlett stopped his truck on the road shoulder on the evening of June 17th and looked through the fence for a long moment. He drove to Decker's Feed and Grain the following morning and told the men there that Earl Mobley had planted his wireworm ground in something he couldn't identify from the road, and that it was either the best decision he'd ever made or a catastrophic mistake. Nobody at Decker's could say which. That uncertainty was its own kind of respect. If this story is landing with you, subscribe. There are more like it. July brought heat that pressed down on Barton County like a flat hand. The county road thermometer recorded 103 degrees on July 11th, and the corn in the West Field required an emergency irrigation pull that cost Earl 4 days and $680 in diesel. The sweet sorghum in the East Field received no additional irrigation. It stood straight in the heat, its root system working the moisture corridors Harold had identified 60 years earlier. drawing from ground that the corn could not reach. On July 22nd, Earl walked the east field at 6 in the morning, when the air was still 74 degrees and smelled of the particular green sugar smell that sweet sorghum develops in high heat, not sweet exactly, more vegetable and faintly fermented, a smell that pulled him back to childhood mornings when Harold ran sorghum in the back field before breakfast. He put his hand around a stalk near the field's center. The diameter was 1¾ inches. He pressed the stalk between his thumb and forefinger. The juice ran against his palm. He walked to the barn and pulled open the double doors to the lean-to addition Harold had built in 1948. The Columbus Iron Works three-roller cane mill sat on its concrete pad where it had sat since 1931. Cast iron, painted black where it wasn't worn silver, 380 pounds. The feed rollers smooth from 60 years of use. The juice channel running downward to a catch basin lined with food-grade tin that Harold had installed in 1952. Earl had greased the roller bearings in March, as he did every March, using the maintenance log Harold had started in 1935, and Earl had continued without interruption. The log ran to 147 pages. That morning's entry would be the 591st. He ran the mill with a belt drive off the Super MTA, the tractor idling at 600 RPM in the lean-to doorway, while the rollers turned at the rate Harold had marked in red pencil on the mill housing. Slow. The juice ran green gold into the catch basin and smelled of raw cane and summer. He cooked the juice in Harold's 60-gallon evaporating pan over a wood-fired arch furnace outside the barn's north wall. 6 hours per batch, slow heat, skimming the green foam that rose in the first hour, watching the color shift from pale gold to amber to the dark reddish-brown that meant the sugar had concentrated to the right density. He used the candy thermometer Harold had bought in 1941. He pulled the syrup at 228 degrees Fahrenheit, exactly as Harold had written it in the notebook. He filled 200-quart mason jars on the first cook, sealed them with new lids and labeled each with white paper tape and a black marker. Honey Drip Sorghum Molasses, Barton County, Ks 1994. It was August 3rd. In the second week of August, a second problem arrived. The crop insurance adjuster assigned to Earl's corn acres, a man named Frank Wicker from a Wichita office, surveyed the wireworm-damaged 30 acres of the west field and informed Earl that the prevent plant provision had closed on June 1st. The damage was real and the documentation was adequate, but the claim window had closed. There would be no payment on the corn ground. Earl listened. He said, "So there's no claim." Wicker said, "Not as things stand." Earl said nothing and watched him go. Then he drove to Great Bend and sat in the office of his attorney, Ruth Chambers, for 40 minutes. Ruth Chambers had handled Earl's legal affairs for 11 years and knew how to begin things quietly. She sent a certified letter to the insurance company's regional director the following Monday, requesting the written documentation of the June 1st provision deadline and the specific policy language that applied to Earl's case. It was not a lawsuit. It was a document request. She told Earl it would take time. Earl drove home and ran the mill again on August 17th, and again on August 31st. By September 4th, he had 847 quart jars sealed in the cellar below the farmhouse, and the east field had not finished yielding. He had not done the arithmetic in writing. He did it in his head at the kitchen table on the evening of September 5th and sat with it for a while. Then he went back to the barn. The Great Bend Farmers Market ran every Saturday from May through October on the courthouse square on William Street. Earl had never sold anything there before in his life. He backed his C10 to the curb at 6:15 on the morning of September 17th, carried his folding table to the sidewalk in front of the courthouse steps, and set up 40-quart jars in 4 rows of 10. He made a sign on a piece of cardboard with a black marker, "Honey Drip Sorghum Molasses, $8 QT." He opened his folding chair and poured coffee from a thermos and waited. By 8 a.m., he had sold 22 jars. By 10 a.m., he had sold all 40 and written down the names and phone numbers of 31 people who wanted more. He returned the following Saturday with 60 jars. He sold all 60 before noon. 3 restaurant owners from Great Bend contacted him by phone the following Wednesday, and one from Larnd, a man who ran a farm-to-table operation that had opened in 1992, wanted a standing order of 20-quart jars per month through the winter. Word traveled in the particular way it travels in small Kansas counties, person to person at fence lines and feed stores, by phone between kitchen tables. No newspapers. No internet, because it was 1994 and the internet had not yet reached kitchen tables in Barton County. What traveled was a number. Earl Mobley had sold out of jars at the courthouse market every Saturday morning before most people had finished breakfast, and the jars were selling for $8 apiece. Larry Catlett heard the total September figure, $6,776 in market sales alone, from a woman at Decker's who had done the arithmetic on her fingers. He did not believe it. He drove to the courthouse square the following Saturday and counted jars from his truck. He watched hands pass money. He watched the table empty. He drove to Earl's farm that afternoon and stood at the fence line of the east field, looking at the dark green stalks still standing in the corridor zones, still unharvested. He said, "What is that exactly?" Earl said, "Sweet sorghum." Catlett said, "Your dad ran sorghum." Earl said, "Yes." Catlett was quiet a moment. He said, "I had wireworm pressure in my northeast corner last spring. I treated it." Earl said nothing. Catlett said, "I was wrong about what you were doing out here." Earl said, "Most people were." Catlett nodded once. He got back in his truck. On October 14th, Ruth Chambers received a written response from the insurance company's regional claims director, acknowledging that the June 1st provision documentation had not been clearly communicated in Earl's original policy materials. The letter offered a settlement of $4,100 against the damaged corn acres as a good faith resolution. It was not the full prevent plant value. It covered the chlorpyrifos cost and the diesel. Ruth Chambers accepted it on Earl's behalf the following morning. Dale Prescott drove to the farm on October 22nd unannounced. Earl was in the Linta running the last press of the season, the Super MTA idling in the doorway, the mill turning slow. Prescott stood in the Linta entrance and watched. He said, "The yield on that sorghum." Earl said, 943 quarts finished product. Prescott was quiet. 943 quarts at $8 was $7,544. Against the $17,856 in projected corn income that had required a successful chemical treatment the East field might not have survived, the molasses number was lower in absolute terms, but it was real income. The corn income had been a projection. These were cash in hand with a waiting list. Prescott said, "I was wrong to move past the sorghum option that quickly." Earl said, "You gave me the standard answer." Prescott said, "The standard answer was wrong for your ground." Earl said nothing and watched the juice run. This channel finds stories like this one. Subscribe so you don't miss the next. In January of 1995, Prescott wrote a 2-page typed letter to Dr. Margaret Howell in the agronomy department at Kansas State University describing the Mobley operation, the wireworm corridor correlation with historic moisture retention zones, and Harold's 1938 notebook entry. He asked Howell to determine whether the corridor planting approach warranted formal study. He did not present it as his own idea. He named Harold Mobley, and he named the notebook, and he named the date. Howell drove to the farm in March 1995 with 2 graduate students. She took soil cores from the wireworm pressure zones and from the clay ground to the north. The laboratory results came back in April. The wireworm zones carried an average organic matter content of 4.2%. The adjacent clay ground carried 1.8%. The wireworm zones also retained measurably more moisture at depth, across every test interval. They were, in soil science terms, the best ground on the farm. They had simply been matched to the wrong crop. Howell published a field note in the Kansas Cooperative Extension Service Bulletin in July 1995. She described what she called pest pressure as soil indicator, the counterintuitive observation that heavy wireworm infestation often correlated with high organic matter zones that were poorly suited for conventional corn, but well suited for deep-rooting specialty crops. She cited Harold Mobley's August 12, 1938 notebook entry by name and date. She recommended that county extension agents consider sorghum and other deep-rooting alternatives before defaulting to chemical treatment and fallow in high wireworm pressure ground. Prescott revised his standard advisory for wireworm infestation beginning with the 1995 crop year. The revision was in writing, in the county extension office's protocol documents, and it remained in those documents. Earl declined 3 requests for newspaper interviews in the fall of 1994. He declined an invitation to speak at a county agricultural meeting in February 1995. He continued running the Columbus Iron Works mill each September, following the maintenance Log Herald had started in 1935, entering each service in the same ruled notebook with the same black pen he had used for 23 years. A seed dealer in Hutchinson, having read Howell's bulletin, began stocking honey-drip sweet sorghum seed for the first time in 11 years in the spring of 1996. By the fall of that year, 4 other farms in Barton County had pressed their first sorghum runs. None of them had Earl's cumulative soil observation. None of them had Harold's notebooks. But they had the yield, and they had the market, and the Great Bend Farmers Market on William Street was running 2 sorghum tables by September 1996, something that had not happened anywhere in the county since the early 1950s. Randy Titus and his wife Carol, who ran 240 acres south of Ellenwood, converted a wireworm-damaged corner of their corn ground to sweet sorghum on the strength of Howell's Bulletin alone. They produced 340-quart jars in their first year, sold them at $7.50, and cleared $2,550 from ground that had been assigned to a prevent plant claim. They told the story to everyone who asked and mentioned Earl Mobley's name every time. Earl did not know this until Vera Stull told him at the fence line in October 1996. He listened. He said, "Good for them." Then he went back to the barn. By 2003, Earl was 76. His hands had changed in the way that hands change after 70 years of outdoor work, darker, the knuckles enlarged, the grip still strong but slower to open in cold weather. He had hired a part-time hand named Cody Reeves, 24 years old, the son of a neighbor, who had been coming to the farm 3 days a week since 2001, and who had learned to run the Super MTA and to set the Columbus Iron Works mill at the correct roller tension. Earl had taught him to read sorghum stalks at the fence line the way Harold had taught Earl, by the color of the joint above the second node, which told you the sugar content before a single stalk was pressed. In the fall of 2003, Cody asked Earl why he maintained the mill by hand on a documented schedule instead of having a modern hydraulic press installed, which would have processed 3 times the volume in half the time. Earl took the maintenance log from the shelf and set it on the workbench between them. He opened it to Harold's first entry, dated March 14, 1935, the first service performed on the Columbus Iron Works mill after Harold acquired it used from a farm sale in Russell County. He said, "This mill has pressed every year since 1931. It's pressed in drought years and flood years and years when the price wasn't worth the fuel to cook it. It's pressed because the maintenance was done correctly every year without a single year skipped." He closed the log. He said, "A hydraulic press doesn't have a maintenance log that starts in 1935. It has a manual that comes in a plastic sleeve and gets thrown in a drawer. That's not the same thing." Cody was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is there anything in the log I should know about that you haven't shown me?" Earl handed him the log. He said, "Start at the beginning." Cody read the log that winter, sitting at Earl's kitchen table on evenings after the work was done. He found Harold's 1938 entry in the field observation section that Harold had appended to the back of the maintenance records. He asked Earl about it. Earl told him the full story, the wireworm channels in May 1994, the photographs on Dale Prescott's desk, the honey drip seed ordered from Selena, the 943 quarts, the $7,544, the waiting list of names he still kept in a folder in the kitchen drawer because he had never needed to look for new customers after that first Saturday. Cody said, "You never wrote that story in the log." Earl said, "The log records what was done to maintain the equipment. What happened in the fields, that's in the fields." Cody said, "But somebody needs to write it down." Earl looked at him across the workbench. He said, "That's what you're doing right now." The Columbus Iron Works three-roller cane mill still sits on its concrete pad in the lean-to addition Harold Mobley built in 1948. The maintenance log, now 217 pages, records every service performed on it since March 1935. The feed rollers are worn to 4.5 inches in diameter, down from the original 5, but they still press clean. The juice still runs gold into the channel and smells of raw cane and summer heat, and the particular fermented green smell of a crop that has been in the ground long enough to concentrate what the soil had to give. Harold Mobley read his fields the way most people never learn to read anything, with patience, with repetition, and with the understanding that damage is not the same thing as destruction. The wireworm did not ruin the East Field in May 1994. It identified it. It drew a map, in the particular language of soil biology and root pressure, of exactly where the best ground was, the ground with the most organic matter, the most moisture retention, the deepest root history going back to the original buffalo grass. Earl read that map because Harold had spent 40 years teaching him what to look for. What the Extension Office offered in 1994 was not wrong. Exactly. Chlorpyrifos and a delayed planting were reasonable responses to a real problem. But reasonable responses to real problems are built for average ground, average conditions, average farms. Harold's ground was not average, and Harold had known this because he had spent 40 years measuring it and writing down what he measured in a spiral notebook in pencil before breakfast. On an August morning in 1938, when the wireworms were running through the old buffalo grass corridors, and the county agent's answer was already in the catalog. The knowledge did not require a university to produce. It required attention. It required the discipline to write down what you noticed before you forgot what you noticed. It required a man who understood that the worst-looking piece of ground on the farm might be, in the right hands, the best. That is where the knowledge lives. Not in the bulletin. Not in the brick building on 10th Street. In the field, in the log, in the hands of whoever was patient enough to walk every row before making the call. If you've made it this far, subscribe and share this with someone who still believes the old ways have nothing left to teach.